Hello, I'm Nelson Liu and welcome to Western Perspective. Believe it or not, it's already December and 2019 is about to come to an end. From the shocking election win of Scott Morrison to the stunning allegation of corruption within a state government department, it's hard not to say that 2019 has been nothing but spectacular in its own right. For the next 3 episodes, we'll look back at this year's major issues in politics, economy and local matters. In part 1, I was joined by Dr Ian Cook, who gave his take on politics in 2019 and what young people can expect next year. It's been a bit of a big year state-wise and federally in terms of politics. Can you give us your take on what's been happening this year?
Well, I guess the biggest moment was the federal election when we had a surprise win on the part of the Liberal National Coalition. And in some ways, I guess the earlier part of the year was leading up to that, and then subsequently, at a federal level, we're dealing with government being elected that really wasn't absolutely ready to be elected.
Okay, so what about the state?
Yeah, at a state level, Mark McGowan's had a relatively solid year. We haven't seen a lot of progress on economic matters. We're not seeing sort of levels of job creation that we need, particularly for younger people. The payroll tax cuts, that may well help. But for the most part, McGowan is sort of presiding over a relatively sluggish economy, and we're not seeing, a lot of movement there. And we're looking at, agreement with the federal and state governments to try to get things moving. But I think it's the sort of economics that's really been a problem, and meaning for a fairly sort of, lacklustre result at a state level for this year.
So what have been the biggest highlights, state-wise and also nationally?
Well, I think to some extent, at the state level, we're looking at sort of various sorts of economic reforms. To some extent, they've had to sort of back off a little bit on the tax on foreign buyers by allowing sort of stamp duty rebates. They've, had to sort of rethink their ideas about Perth, not being, being redesignated as not a major city anymore, so we can get sort of more immigration here, so we can get generally sort of more economic sort of boost into the economy. So we're looking at those sort of policies. I guess toward the end, we've been pretty much obsessed with voluntary assisted dying and the legislation and the sorts of games that seem to be playing around that legislation.
So both Mark McGowan and Scott Morrison have also had their downsides this year. Can you tell us what you think have been the things that are giving both leaders fits throughout this whole year?
Well, obviously the corruption scandal in the state's public sector for this year was a pretty major headache for Mark McGowan. Pretty poor look. Questions around what sort of oversight is being conducted around these sorts of officials. So, the corruption, I think, was problematic. Scott Morrison, to some extent, it's been sort of relatively, bubbling along. We've had the Angus Taylor sort of fiasco around Clover Moore and interference in New South Wales elections. So we've had some of that. Certainly the National Party's been a bit of a mess, and that hasn't helped Scott Morrison sort of, maintaining his position. For the most part, though, it's been a government trying to work out what to do at a federal level, and it's come up with sort of religious freedom and union sort of bashing, classic sort of Liberal Party stuff when they don't really have many other ideas.
You mentioned Scott Morrison being elected in his first full year of government. How's he gotten this year?
Well, there's been no one upset. I don't think he's had any sort of major setbacks, major issues. We're not seeing a really clear legislative agenda. We're not really seeing a clear program for Parliament. The budget they handed down before they went into the election has sort of limited them in terms of the capacity to move. So for the most part, I think we're still waiting for Scott Morrison to define himself as a Prime Minister, to define this government in terms of its legislative agenda, where it's going to go forward. And I think we're sort of a little bit waiting and seeing at that.
How do you think he's handled some of the big issues like robo-debt and Medivac and China? Has he handled them to the degree that we expect him to?
Well, certainly, the Medivac, they got it through with Jackie Lambie. To some extent, it's sort of come back on her more than Scott Morrison. For the most part, he's been relatively solid. He hasn't been shaken. He's not been sort of, running for cover or trying to hide. He's pretty much stayed up there. He's taken some of the hits, been relatively solid around that. Labor Party hasn't laid any sort of major blows, I don't think, around the sorts of headaches that Scott Morrison's had. So for the most part, he's done the sort of job we'd expect. He's a pretty good salesperson, and he sort of maintains a sort of a stable image, and he's been projecting that reasonably effectively across the year.
In WA, has Mark McGowan done the job that we all expect him to?
Mark McGowan has been classically Mark McGowan, pretty solid across the board. Economically, we're still not getting anywhere. So in terms of delivering on some of those election promises, to job creation, economic stimulus, we're really not seeing that so far. So for the most part, it's been a sort of average performance from Mark McGowan, and we're still looking to see sort of real progress on some pretty major sort of policy areas.
How about the state budget, though? Have we reached the surplus that we wanted to?
Look, we're seeing numbers where the budget looks sort of relatively solid. There's lots of underlying figures that show that, financially we're not in absolutely great shape. So, they've done a solid appearance of creating a sense that, everything's more or less under control, and it sort of is. But at deeper levels, WA economy's in not a really good place, the budget's in not a real good place, and it's going to be like that for quite a while forward.
What about your take? Is this going to be enough to get him over the line in the next state election?
I think for the most part, then we've got to start looking at Lisa Harvey and the extent to which she's been able to hold things together. In this voluntary assisted dying process, not always seem to be in control of her party, not always seem to be in control of that. So I've got a few question marks around Lisa Harvey, and she's got to put herself in a place where she's electable. If she can't move there, then Mark McGowan's in a pretty safe ground, because until the opposition can show that they're ready to take on government, unless, Mark McGowan really screws up badly, he's a pretty good show, for winning the next state election.
State-wise and federally, what can young people expect from both Mark McGowan and Scott Morrison?
Well, I think it's very much the same thing for both of them. Sort of economic reform, some sort of attempt to sort of stimulate employment for young Western Australians, because young Western Australians are really struggling to get into the labour market, and if you can't get in, you can't stay in. So we really need Scott Morrison and Mark McGowan to work together for real economic progress for young people. We also need action on environment. We need to sort of have them working together effectively, because for the most part we're not seeing much movement in terms of environmental policy, and I think that's something else that young people really need action on.
Have they had young people's interests at heart this year at all?
I think for the most part, as usual, young people have been pretty much forgotten in state and federal politics. Occasional mentions, occasional sort of recognition of the fact that they're sort of, in terms of job situation, not in a good place. But really, not a lot of action, not a lot of targeted policy, not a lot of direct concern, much more interest in the interests of sort of older voters.
Dr. Ian Cook, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
And that's all the time we have for this week. We'll be back again next week with part 2 of our series. Until then, it's back to you, Ivan and Sarah.
Thank you, Nelson. This week's main news again. The voluntary assisted dying laws has passed the upper house, with 24 voted yes and 11 voted no. Although the bill passed before Christmas as the government had hoped for, there are concerns that will be hard to implement due to Commonwealth laws. And that's our weekly news and current affairs. We have the latest news on the website and social media pages.
Until next Sunday after 8 p.m, thank you for watching. Good evening.
Take care.